Once upon a time, more than 2,500 years ago, there was a privileged young man who grew up knowing many comforts. His father had tried to protect him from ever seeing illness or old age or differently abled bodies or poverty or death. This father had hoped to shield his son from suffering by keeping him from seeing things as they really are. As the story goes, in time, this young man, Siddhartha, left the comforts of his protected childhood, and he saw all the things that his father tried to keep him from. In his despair over inequity and suffering in life, this young man left his family, renounced all his possessions and his privilege, joined an austere community in his efforts to try to find meaning and purpose in life. In time, he grew disillusioned, thinking there must be some kind of middle way, some way between austerity and indulgence. So he sat down under a tree to meditate for a long time. And when the time came for him to rise from under the tree, his closest fellow seekers noticed that his appearance had changed. There was a kind of radiance about him. It was as though he were lit from within. And as the story goes, a monk approached him and, amazed by his luminosity, said to him, "O Holy One, what are you? You must be a god." And the Buddha, not thinking of himself as anything but present, answered, "No, I'm not a god." And he kept walking. And the monk persisted. "Then you must be a diva." And the Buddha stopped and said, "No, I'm not a diva." And he kept walking. And still the monk pursued him, and he said, "Then you must be Brahman himself." And the Buddha said, "No, I am not." Confused, the monk pressed him again. And he said, "Then what are you? Tell me. Please, what are you?" And the Buddha answered, "I am awake. I am awake." Even though we do it at least once every day, it isn't easy to awaken. And although there's no evidence of it in this room, it isn't always easy to stay awake either. In the stories our tradition gives us of another spiritual teacher born some 500 years later than the Buddha, we have this haunting story of Jesus of Nazareth. The story that Dawn read for us. A story of Jesus with his nearest and dearest. And among the very final words the story gives him to speak to his closest friends, Jesus poses this heartbreaking question. In the dark of the night, in the darkest time of his life, in the dark garden in which he has sought the wisdom of ancient trees, this one who is about to be captured and killed by the empire he dared to challenge says to his friends, "Can you not stay awake with me? Can you not stay awake to what is true? Can you not stay awake to seeing who it is that benefits and who pays? Can you not stay awake to the way things are, to what's happening to us and around us? Can you not stay awake to the dream we've been exploring these years together of what could yet be possible? It's a life question, really. A question that transcends this garden and this story and this time and this place. Is it not really a question for every spiritual being in a human experience? Can we awaken and can we stay awake? And much like the time in which these three friends of Jesus found themselves living, we find ourselves living in a time in which it is very hard to stay awake. An old song early in the liberation movement for women comes to me in these days again and again. Words written in 1974 by Carol Etzler. Words that were written about the oppression of lesbian women in that time, but words that are too true and timely. Words that still speak to the global and personal issues we face every day. This was her song. It was called "Sometimes I Wish." Sometimes I wish my eyes hadn't been opened. Sometimes I wish I could no longer see all of the pain and the hurt and the longing of my sisters and me as we try to be free. Sometimes I wish my eyes hadn't been opened just for an hour. How sweet it would be not to be struggling, not to be striving, but just to be sleeping securely in our slavery. But now that I've seen with my eyes, I can't close them, because deep inside me, somewhere I'd still know the road that my sisters and I have to travel. My heart would say yes, and my feet would say go. Sometimes I wish my eyes hadn't been opened. But now that they have, I'm determined to see that somehow my sisters and I will one day the free people be we were created to be. It's hard to awake, and it's even harder to unsee and unhear. It's tempting to close our eyes to poverty, to war, to the threat of nuclear disaster, to rude and uncivil exchanges that dominate public life, to corruption and deceit at phenomenal levels, to the death of birds on tailing ponds, the loss of right whales to tanker traffic and fishing nets, to severe storms and climate shifts, to the number of species growing extinct, to the melting of ice caps and the diminishment of our lakes, to racial tension and violence, hunger and homelessness. It's tempting to close our eyes to the displacement of so many who flee their homeland in search of safety and some measure of security. It's hard to keep our eyes open to the terror in which so many in the world live. It's hard to keep our hearts open to more cancer, more disease, more dementia. It's hard to awaken and hard to stay awake to all that is. Like an arm that we lay on, or a leg that we sit on, our hearts can fall asleep too, can become numb, so weighted by the realities of life. And waking brings those pins and needles not just to our limbs, but to our soul. Don't those words of Mark Nepo resonate with our reality fatigue? That we go numb along the way is to be expected. Even the bravest among us who give their lives to care for others go numb with fatigue when the heart can take in no more, when we need time to digest all that we meet. Overloaded and overwhelmed, we start to pull back from the world so we can internalize what the world keeps giving us. Perhaps the noblest private act is the unheralded effort to return, to open our hearts once they've closed, to open our souls once they've shied away, to soften our minds once they've been hardened by the storms of life. And the truth is, none of us can stay awake all the time. None of us can stay awake permanently. We're creatures that rehearse our death every day by sleeping, escaping the realities of conscious life and waking and rising to awareness again and again, day after day. We know we can't survive as healthy beings without sleep. And we can't survive the pain of the world in the hypervigilance of being immersed in its raw reality. Nor can we truly stay present to the utter beauty and magnificence of what it is to be alive in the world either. That's why we need possibility. And maybe all of this is why we need spiritual community. Couldn't those three friends have found a better way to stay awake? Because what if being spiritual community is about taking turns, about sharing the vigil, supporting one another as we take our turn to stay with what is, to keep one another from refusing to let go of what could be, of sharing the responsibility in a sustainable way so that some are always awake and some are resting for their time to be awake. Like divers who always dive in pairs. Because diving into the deep always comes with danger. Surely one of the strategies to diminish that danger is to take turns so that someone is always watching the time and the line while someone is probing the deep. And as that one returns to the surface, the other takes to the deep. Sharing the watch, alternating the work with one another of waking one another, balancing our resources for vigilance. It takes community and it takes generations of community. And we take our place in circles like this to awaken one another, to share the work of staying with and staying awake, to ensure that someone is always watching, someone is witnessing, someone is requiring accountability, someone is holding the vision, and taking turns with the vision we inherit, the values we hold dear, the beloved community we perpetuate all these centuries. Collectively, it's our best hope for remaining inoculated against apathy and ignorance and indifference, that we will inspire and relieve one another in the work of healing the world. The political machinery of every empire counts on citizens staying asleep, not stirring awake. Tomorrow is one of those opportunities to stay awake. to exercise a responsibility and a privilege many have died for. This ancient story comes to us that we might stay awake together, to inoculate ourselves against ignorance and indifference and going numb, to keep us from all falling asleep, to find a way together for collective wakefulness, to shift and share the responsibility, to keep us from the numbness that corruption and cruelty and violence and injustice requires. So as we consider the ABCs of living deeply, of being worthy of our breath, let us take this time to pause, to consider in our minds and in our hearts how we can keep one another awake, and what might be the acts that we can do collectively as those who are fully awake.